go. Fab. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll move on. So I'm going to start with an overview of the Removing Barriers to Apprenticeships programme. I know we've got a real mixture here of people who know lots about the programme and people who might be encountering it for the first time. And we've also got lots of people from the individual project teams too, which is really good. So I'll try and give an overview that works for everyone and not harp on too much about things you already know about. So if we could move on to the next slide. So to start with, what is removing barriers and why did we do this? What are we doing in the first place? So the Removing Barriers to Apprenticeships programme came from our belief that everybody who can benefit from an apprenticeship should have a fair chance to access one. Apprenticeships are quite unique in offering a learning pathway that doesn't penalise disadvantaged learners because they're paid. So we want to try and break down any other barriers that might be there for learners and stopping them accessing those opportunities. The RBA programme tested a range of different interventions for learners from disadvantaged or underrepresented backgrounds to help get them into apprenticeships. It was done on a test and learn basis. And we wanted to see what works best and help us and other organisations target their work in the future so that it has the biggest impact for Greater Manchester and for learners nationwide as well. So moving on, starting in 2020, GMCA, that's us, awarded a total of £328,000 to 7 projects across Greater Manchester, tackling a range of barriers, different barriers to apprenticeships. The projects all operated on a test and learn basis with different groups of learners, but they all had a target of getting at least 10 apprenticeship starts, which are sustained for at least 4 months. The projects came together to share learning on a quarterly basis, and they were evaluated by an external partner, that's Little Lion Research from David. And the projects looked at a range of different barriers related to gender, ethnicity, personal circumstance. We had some for single parents, learning disabilities, age and distance from the labour market. And each of the projects was a little bit different, so I'm going to give a quick overview of each of them now, if we can go on to the next slide. So one of the 7, these are in no particular order. So we had Men in the Early Years, which was a collaboration between Kids Planet Nurseries and the Fatherhood Institute to recruit men into early years settings. They are vastly underrepresented. Only 3% of the early years workforce is male. And they were particularly targeting school leavers and older career changers, so particularly dads and granddads. They aimed to recruit and support a cohort of 12 men through the Kids Planet in-house early years level 2 apprenticeship, with the apprentices working across lots of different settings in Greater Manchester. And as well as learner support, this project included things like training for managers on gender stereotyping, because it was identified that that was sometimes an issue, that actually men would come into the setting, but the managers maybe had their own preconceptions about men being appropriate for early years roles. So that was one project. Moving on, we had the BAME Engineers, which was a partnership of Rochdale Training, Rochdale Borough Council, Positive Steps and Job Centre Plus. And it targeted BAME young people to complete an engineering pre-apprenticeship programme with a view to moving into apprenticeships. And a note on terminology here, so the learners on this project were primarily Pakistani or Bangladeshi, but the project is known as BAME Engineers because that's the term that the learners themselves were happy with. So elsewhere in this evaluation, we might say people from ethnic minorities or use the specific ethnic group, but this naming was quite a good example of co-creation, so we wanted to stick with it. But they completed employability and engineering qualifications, and it was really promoted in community settings using mosques and Crescent Radio. It was a specific BAME cohort, basically, which we'll come on to how exactly that worked and whether that helped with integration. So that's another of the projects. Moving on again. We had Salford Supported Apprenticeships, which was a partnership between Salford City Council, For Housing as the employer, Career Connect and Bolton and Salford colleges. They created supported apprenticeships for aimed for 10 but ended up with 12, I think, cohort of learners aged 16 to 21 with SEND, and they were mostly young white men. This project was quite unique, and it provided although they did have a sort of an enhanced induction, most of the support that they got as part of this project was during the apprenticeship rather than before it. So it's a bit unique. It's not something we've come across before, and it's unique amongst these removing barriers projects too. And they had lots of dedicated mentoring support for the learners, but also for the employer and the training provider. On to the next one, we had single parent teaching assistants. So this was through Rochdale Training, Rochdale Borough Council, Positive Steps and Job Centre Plus. They targeted single parents who would complete a teaching assistant pre-apprenticeship with a view to going into teaching assistant or early years practitioner. And it was specific, the training was specifically designed to fit around childcare commitments. It's known that it's a, school-based apprenticeships are school-based roles are popular with single parents because of the hours, so the training was designed to fit around that too. And then moving on, we had the digital supported apprenticeship, which was a partnership between the White Room, Total People, Manchester City Council and Pure Innovations. And that provided additional resource for a new digital supported apprenticeship, which was designed for young people with SEND, particularly those with autism spectrum disorder. And it was a pre-apprenticeship programme intended to lead into a range of level 3 and 4 digital apprenticeships. And then I think we've got 2 more. So yeah, we had Coldhurst Awards in Oldham, which was a partnership between Oldham Council, Get Oldham Working, and the Northern Care Alliance, which is NHS. It had a really hyper-local focus on Coldhurst Ward in Oldham, which is one of the most deprived wards in the whole country, hence the really local focus. And it had a specific look at single parents, BAME residents, and those with mental health conditions. It was a pre-apprenticeship programme intended to lead to apprenticeships in healthcare with the Northern Care Alliance. And they did lots of community-based recruitment, so they did information and recruitment sessions at mosques and community centres. And then I think the last one, there we go, can I count to 7? So we had the Oldham 16 to 25-year-olds, which again was a partnership between Oldham Council and the Northern Care Alliance, but that was looking more broadly at the whole of Oldham, and it was to support, it was a pre-apprenticeship programme to support younger people aged 16 to 25 into, again, somewhat healthcare related apprenticeships. So they did lots of employability skills, travel training, introduction to working in healthcare, and they tried to make sure that there was that all the training was sort of healthcare related because it's an occupational programme. And to give you just a very quick feel, we're going to talk a lot about the impact later on, but I want to give you a quick feel for the type of people that have benefited from these projects. So I want to share a very quick story from a learner on one of the Oldham 16 to 25 project. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this was one learner who said, I left college when I found out I was pregnant with twins. Being a young mum, as well as helping my dad look after my sister who had disabilities, meant that I didn't have much time for myself. At the beginning, I felt really drained and I was nervous, but I took a risk and I realised that nothing comes easy. And, she's grown in confidence so much. I'm so proud of myself. I don't even have the words for it. I feel so encouraged and can't wait for the future. So this one learner, Chloe, has got a work placement at Royal Oldham Hospital. And we've had a really recent bit of feedback from the ward manager that she's doing fantastically. So every learner is different, but I think it's really important to right from the start understand that these projects were small, they were small scale. We're talking maybe maximum 40 learners in a cohort, but all of those people are individuals and they've had such a big impact for these individuals. And I think it's really important to see that as we go into looking at the programme as a whole. And then I think that's it from me with this bit, so I'm going to pass over to David.
Thanks, Amy, and hello, everybody. Yep, so my name is David Morris from Little Lion Research, and over the last 16 months, we've been tracking the progress of learners across the 7 projects. Our research has included analysis of the quarterly monitoring data that each project team has been submitting to GMCA. We've run baseline and follow-up surveys of learners, and we've had face-to-face consultations with learners, training providers, employers and project teams as we've been allowed to as lockdown's been going on. And the research has generated a range of evidence around the barriers to learning that different groups of learners face, and also how effective the projects have been at removing those barriers. So I'm just going to talk you through now some of the things we found and the implications for policy, and then Amy will come back in at the end to talk about how GMCA is planning to take some of the evidence and learning forwards. I just want to start by giving you a bit more detail on the profile of learners across the 7 projects. So this is from the monitoring information the project team submitted to GMCA each quarter. So across the evaluation period, the 7 projects have worked with 145 learners. The majority of learners have been female, so just under 60% compared to 41% male. And the majority of learners have been what we've termed younger learners, so under the age of 25. Important to note in what follows when I talk about older learners, not necessarily talking about people who are old in terms of age. Older learners as a group includes parents, single adults, etc., as Amy's introduced. In terms of the ethnic profile of 145 learners, whilst the group was majority white, we can see there was a strong representation of learners from Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnic backgrounds. The majority of learners on the 7 projects live to the north and east of Greater Manchester, as the map here shows. Sorry if it's a bit difficult to see. It's interesting to note that those home postcodes mapped there broadly correlate with what we know of more economically deprived neighbourhoods and areas of Greater Manchester. And just under half of learners were unemployed when they came onto their project. Only about a fifth were actually in work and moving from one line of work to another, for instance. So as I say, nearly half were unemployed and a further 7% were economically inactive. The monitoring data that project teams submitted to Greater Manchester Combined Authority included a question asking teams to identify and rank up to 5 barriers to learning that each learner on their project faced. And those barriers were selected from a predefined list. It was a drop down, so we could then compare barriers between projects and between learner groups. Project teams were most likely to view a learner's lack of confidence and low aspirations as being their barrier to learning. But it's important to note that whilst that was the most often mentioned barrier, it wasn't most often ranked the first or second most prominent barrier. Often there were other barriers specific to learners that project teams identified. So these were things like the learner coming from a group which is perhaps underrepresented in the workforce or the sector they wish to work in. It was about the learner perhaps having childcare or other caring responsibilities. It might be that the learner had a mental health barrier which could influence their ability to engage and sustain their training and subsequently enter the workforce. And those barriers were often ranked number 1 or 2 as most important, with, as I say, lack of confidence, low aspirations being a further barrier for that individual. Also important to note that project teams perceive that barriers were quite specific to certain learner groups. So what we mean by that is, for instance, 90% of all mentions of childcare responsibilities as a barrier to learning were from one project team. Likewise, another project team which were working with learners from ethnic minorities identified that group's underrepresentation in the workforce as a barrier to learning and progression for those learners. So barriers were seen as being quite specific to specific groups of learners. In the baseline survey, we also asked learners directly what they felt were the barriers to them learning, with the aim of obviously comparing that back to what project teams had told us. And the key and really interesting point to come from this was that 70% of learners did not feel that any aspect of their identity was a barrier to them getting the career they wanted. So they did not feel that their gender, their age, their ethnicity, their religion, etc. was a barrier to them learning and progressing. However, whilst learners did not perceive any aspects of their identity as barriers, they did identify other barriers in their livelihoods, in their circumstances, that could make it hard for them to engage and sustain learning. So, for instance, a lot of learners talked about the lack of previous educational attainment, negative previous experiences of mainstream schooling, limited or no knowledge of training opportunities, not knowing what career paths they wanted. These were all often cited by a majority or large minorities of learners as things that they felt were strong barriers to them sustaining their learning. So what this suggests, especially when we compare it back to the previous challenges identified by project teams, is perhaps talking about the language of barriers to learners is incorrect. Rather, it's about, for learners, making them aware of options, pathways, opening doors, for instance, as training providers, as policymakers, because learners themselves don't perceive their identity to be a barrier to them making progression. Rather, it's about their experiences and making them realise that just because you don't have those experiences of education and training doesn't mean you can't go back to education and training and flourish. And we'll come back to that when we talk about policy recommendations. Different groups of learners in the baseline survey identified different barriers to themselves progressing in their training. For instance, female learners were more likely to say that they lacked information about training opportunities, and more likely to say they felt they weren't qualified enough to take up a training place. Learners with learning difficulties and disabilities, on the other hand, this group were a lot more likely to mention physical or mental health issues or worries as being a barrier to them sustaining learning. They, as a group, were also often worried about travelling for training, travelling for work, and working with strangers. So again, the policy implication of how we speak about barriers, how we support different groups of learners to explore and understand their options needs to be quite highly tailored to the group we're working with. In terms of the support that projects have given to the learners over the last 16 months, so the 7 projects used a range of different delivery methods. One-to-one support through tutors and mentors and classroom-based learning methods were most commonly used, but significant minorities of learners also had on-the-job training. A small number also had access to bursaries, for instance, to help them cover things like travel costs and sustaining their training. Nearly all of the support that was delivered was at level 2 or below, and learner feedback in the follow-up survey on all aspects of training was extremely positive. So learners have really enjoyed their time with training providers and feel that they've developed some really interesting and useful knowledge as a result. I want to move on now to talk a bit about the impact the projects have had in terms of reducing the barriers to learning that individual learners face. In terms of headline outputs, so as Amy explained at the start, the 7 projects had a range of contractual targets, and they reported against those on a quarterly basis through the monitoring information. So the 7 projects as a whole have engaged 145 learners over the last 16 months, 28 of whom have started an apprenticeship. All 7 of the projects recruited 5 or more new learners, with the 2 largest projects each recruiting around 40 learners. And 6 of the 7 projects recorded at least 1 apprenticeship start, with the most apprenticeship starts recorded by a project being 12. In addition to the apprenticeship starts, the projects noted a range of other outcomes, positive outcomes, that they've delivered for their learners. So 17 of the 145, so this is in addition to those who are on apprenticeships, have been recruited onto temporary or permanent contracts with an employer. So not an apprenticeship, but a job nevertheless. 2 learners have entered self-employment, and several learners are at present volunteering, either in the line of work they want to be working in or another community organisation, for instance. And many learners continue to train, develop their skills, and as we'll see, they're enthused about training and their future training prospects. So a range of positive outcomes delivered by the 7 projects, in addition to the headline numbers. In terms of whether learners still face barriers to progressing in their learning, in the follow-up survey, we put a question to learners, not directly comparable to the baseline, but very similar. asking if they still faced barriers to learning. It should be noted here that we got 25 completions of a follow-up survey compared to 90 or so for the baseline. So the following analysis is on a small sample size and should be treated with caution, thusly. Of those who did complete a follow-up survey, just over half said that they felt they still faced barriers to learning. And non-white ethnic learners and older learners, so those aged over 25, were more likely than others to say that they felt they still faced barriers or challenges to learning. In detail, the specific barriers that learners in the follow-up survey said they still faced, the key one appears to be around mental health and how that influences a learner's ability to engage and sustain with learning and be functional and engage with colleagues in the workplace. So 60% of learners who still faced a barrier mentioned mental health as that barrier. And then large minorities mentioned worries around COVID, issues still around confidence, that they could do the job and they could be effective in the workplace. Issues around getting to and from work for a minority of learners are still present. We also dug into that data, and as I say, we're small sample size, so this needs to be treated with caution, but it does appear that learners who consider themselves to have a learning difficulty or disability, and also male learners as a group, were more concerned about their mental health still being a barrier to learning at the time of the follow-up survey. For those learners who are now in the workplace on an apprenticeship, it's clear that they're having a really positive time. So more than 2/3 of those learners say that they are applying what they learn in the classroom or through their one-to-one tutoring, often or all of the time when they're in the workplace. And over 3/4 of learners say that the support they receive from line managers and other employees is good or very good. So employers are stepping up to the plate. They have integrated these learners within their workforce and they're supporting them as they need. Learners are appreciating that and feeling that they're able to apply their skills. So a really positive story for the minority of learners who now are in the workplace. The follow-up survey also asked learners about their plans for the future. So we asked 3 questions on this topic. Firstly, we asked learners whether they were confident they complete their apprenticeship or training, then if they progress in their chosen career, and if they continue to seek out training in future. And you can see from this slide that, again, majorities on all questions are confident or very confident. So 3/4 of learners in the follow-up survey said they were confident or very confident they'd actually complete their apprenticeship or training. And over 70% said that they continue to seek out training to develop their skills. So if you remember, this was a group in general who'd had fairly negative or distant experiences of mainstream education. They've perhaps been out of a classroom setting for quite some time, but they've really re-engaged with learning and developing their skills, and they've enjoyed that. 53% were confident or very confident that they progress in their chosen career. So obviously that's lower than those who'd say they complete their apprenticeship or training. I think it's clear that some of the learners, especially those we spoke to, are sort of still exploring their new area of work, if you like, and working out if that's where they want to work. That's the sector they want to work in the longer term. But still a majority are confident or very confident it is the sector they want to work in. Younger learners were more confident than older learners on all 3 of these measures. That's not to say that older learners, i.e. those aged over 25, are negative about these outcomes. They don't feel that they're going to drop out of their apprenticeship or not progress in their career. It's more that older learners in the follow-up survey were unsure about whether they'd achieve these outcomes, whereas younger learners generally seem more positive about these future outcomes. I want to move on now to just talk you through 3 examples of learners who've been supported through the project. So building on the example that Amy introduced earlier on, the quotes from Chloe the learner. So we've got 3 examples here of learners from different backgrounds who've engaged with different projects and have achieved positive outcomes. So I will just come on to those in a second. Just take a glass of water. The first learner we want to tell you about is a learner, so it's a young white male. So they were on the Oldham to 16 to 25 project. When this individual first became involved with that project, they were unemployed. They just completed a Prince's Trust training course, and they were concerned that they had their mental health would be a barrier to them securing training and securing work. So the quote at the top there from the individual: "I felt like my mental health wasn't healthy enough to start work." They were anxious about this. They were worried as a consequence of that about working with strangers, being in a large work environment surrounded by lots of people they wouldn't know. Really unnerved this young person. And they were also worried that they weren't qualified enough. So from their previous experiences of school and college, they didn't think they had enough qualifications to make them attractive to the NHS as an employer, or to any employer really, to that extent. They did, however, have an aspiration to get a job, to get an apprenticeship, to progress. This young person was driven. They were just nervous and feeling a bit anxious about socialising around that. The learner, we met with them up at Positive Steps. We had a really good discussion with this young person, and they talked to us in detail about the support they had received through the project, and in particular through the one-to-one mentoring and tutor support, and how much they'd gained from that process. There was a very powerful moment in this discussion where the learner was telling us about how their previous experiences of the classroom had not been good ones. They hadn't enjoyed being in classroom and college environments, and how they really appreciated coming into Positive Steps in a small environment where they could be trained, they could bond with others, and realise that those learners perhaps had a similar background to them in terms of their mainstream education, and also how they could get the support they needed from their mentor at pretty much any time of the day. This learner gave an example of several times having crises of confidence, and just being able to speak to their tutor or mentor rather, on the phone or by email, how that would reassure them and give them the confidence to go into the hospital the next day to do their activity, to do their job, for instance. So feedback from Northern Care Alliance is that they felt, this learner would have struggled if they'd come through a traditional employment and recruitment route. They would probably have struggled with the interview and just their anxiety. But now actually that this learner is starting to become really capable, they've taken them onto their staff bank. So that is a bank of employees who are moved around different roles within the trust as and when required, and this learner started to make progress. Second example is an older female learner. So again, this learner was unemployed when she came into contact with the Rochdale, the teaching assistant project. Had been working with Job Centre Job Coach. This learner was interested in a career as a teaching assistant, a career in education, but again, they lack confidence around their ability to do that job, and they were also felt that childcare, so that they are a parent, would be a barrier to them taking up the opportunity, just simply in terms of the timetable and when they'd need to be in school and when they'd be able to pick up and look after their own children. And the project team, they did their initial assessment of this learner, and they noted the same issues. So there's things around care and commitments, worries about travelling for training and work were holding this individual back. So the learner, along with the cohort on the teaching assistant programme, went through a range of sort of pre-apprenticeship training to get them ready for working in a primary school setting. So receiving a mix of classroom, one-to-one and sort of group-based support and skills and training. And the learner gave really positive feedback on that experience. She feels that she's achieved what she set out to at the start. They're no longer worried about childcare and travel issues. They found that actually they can take up their teaching assistant role within a local primary school, and that the timings of that are flexible enough. So we spoke to several participants actually from Rochdale Teaching Assistant Project, and they all mentioned how their schools have been able to flex timetables to allow them on some mornings to drop their own kids off at school and then come in after 9 o'clock, other days to start a bit earlier or work a bit later, for instance, and how that has reassured them and removed those issues around travel and caring responsibilities as barriers. So again, a really positive story. The third learner example I want to give you is a video. So this was produced by Salford City College, a learner on the Salford Supported Apprenticeships Programme. And I want to give thanks to Salford City College and Kay, the learner you're going to hear from in particular, for giving us permission to show this video. So Cade is an apprentice electrician with Liberty Housing, who are a social housing provider based in the west of the city. And Cade studies at Salford College for part of the week, and then he's at Liberty for the rest of the week. And he just talks through here on the video about how his previous experiences of education had shaped his views around training and what he's gained from his training so far. So I'll play this and hopefully it all works. So I hope that video's given you all an experience of one of the learners. We met with Cade and Cameron here, who's on the picture as well, last summer, and it was a really interesting discussion from both of them about the barriers and previous experience they'd had. Some of the key points that both Cade and Cameron mentioned were around how much they enjoyed being in Liberty and also at the college as well, in terms of they felt that they were learning with people who had similar backgrounds to themselves. They felt that they could chat with people and so on. And a really powerful point Cade made was around when he'd been at school, he'd recognised that teachers were trying to do their best for him, but they just came from different backgrounds and they couldn't perhaps understand what was going on in his life the way that the tutors and others through the Liberty scheme have been able to, and through that he's been able to build a real bond with his tutors and with his colleagues at work as well, which as you can see from the various chat and so on, he's doing really well, and I gather he's up for an award this week as part of the City College's National Apprenticeship Week celebration, so he's made great progress. I just want to move on now for the last bit of my presentation before I hand back to Amy, which is just to run through some of the things we have learnt over the last 16 months of research. There's more insight, more detail in the full evaluation report, but just picking out some key things here and implications for training providers and for policymakers as well. First thing, one of the early things we talked about with project teams was how they recruited learners onto their projects. And the evidence was that across all 7 projects, many of them worked with local agencies. So what we mean by that is the council, community groups, Job Centre Plus, for instance, a whole range of agencies who knew the local patch, could identify individuals locally who could benefit from the pre-apprenticeship training and perhaps in due course moving on to a supported apprenticeship. Amy's described in the intro how many of the projects use local media and community links, and several projects did things like open days and taster sessions where potential applicants could come and see the training centre. They could perhaps go onto the employer's site to see where they might be working in future. And those were well received. It was felt that learners could build their confidence and understand, okay, this isn't a big, scary place. It's somewhere where people are friendly, that they'll want to help me, that I'll be surrounded by other learners who have similar backgrounds to myself. So that approach was effective. The projects told us that the number and quality of applicants for the support apprenticeship positions was high. This was felt to be partly as a result of lockdown, meaning that a lot of young people in particular have spent perhaps the last few years not in mainstream education, or perhaps have disengaged, slightly hidden if you like, and now they might be panicking and wondering about their career options. And there was some concern from projects that if more qualified young people are applying for apprenticeships, does that mean the harder to reach groups, those who are underrepresented or face additional barriers, they might get squeezed out, pushed to the back of the queue? In terms of recommendations that the final report makes for practitioners, it's around training providers having those links to a range of local agencies so that you can identify the harder to reach individuals when it comes to your recruitment processes. And in terms of that recruitment process, can you consider the potential as much as a learner's prior attainment? So not just looking at their educational attainment, but do your systems allow you to consider, will this young person be able to overcome barriers and to flourish on this training and subsequently in work and so on? Clearly recommendations around marketing methods and channels. You know, are you reaching out through different community media? Have you the ability to translate your marketing materials, for instance, into other languages? That's not just for the learners themselves, most of whom are obviously happy conversing in English, but what if your project might be seen by parents or grandparents, for instance, who don't speak English as a first language? Can they influence young people to take up opportunities by seeing those opportunities in their own language? And taking applicants into workplaces, showing them what they will be doing. That's a good way of engaging them. For policymakers, recommendations around facilitating networking between. There's a whole range, obviously, of public policies which are about engaging NEET and unemployed individuals in our communities, making sure they're linked in and aware of what supported apprenticeships are and how they can recommend and refer their participants onto those programmes. Providing channels for training providers to funnel their recruitment efforts. So if you've got an event or something coming up, making that a space where people can advertise opportunities, and really encouraging training providers to support harder to reach learners. Around training methods, what we learnt, several training providers extended their induction processes, so not expecting a learner to fill in all the paperwork and to go through every stage very quickly, but recognising it takes time for that learner to experience a new environment, to gain confidence and to trust the people around them, and so on. Linked to that, several tutors and mentors told us that a lot of the underrepresented groups they're working with, the barriers to learning they face might be quite deep-seated and long-standing, and it really takes time for someone to build the trust with another individual to be able to divulge those barriers. It might be quite sensitive topics regarding their personal life. So lengthening that induction process, build that trust. The learner will then tell you what barriers they face and the training provider can respond accordingly. A key bit of learning was around the size of groups and learning. Projects found it more effective often to start with a sort of whole cohort of learners of say 10, 12 learners, and then to break that down into smaller groups and maybe even down to one-to-one support. So once you'd identified learners who perhaps need more help around specific basic skills, taking them out, giving them that one-to-one support they need. Likewise, delivering learning perhaps part-time at first and then bringing learners on full-time, not expecting learners to start full-time from day one with their training provider. That gave them time to work out their other responsibilities, whether that's caring or other things going on in their lives, and how they can fit that around their training. Recommendations for training providers and practitioners here. Several of the training providers have invested in tools which help them understand more about their learners' needs and underlying factors that influence their ability to learn. And the feedback is that those have helped those training providers pick up a lot more and a wider range of barriers and think about how they as training providers respond to those barriers. If you can bring learners together, we've talked about how learners like meeting up with one another, building that trust, saying, you know, that individual, they've had a similar background to me, I can talk openly in front of them and I won't get judged, I won't be seen as the problem within the classroom. We're all in a similar situation, we can all help each other. And reviewing the times, ways, locations in which you deliver training. So a good example here was the Oldham Coldhurst project. So they recognised that a lot of their participants were parents of younger children. So they scheduled some of their initial pre-apprenticeship training to take place in a community venue where downstairs there was a creche, a nursery for younger children. So parents could drop their children off at the creche and then go upstairs for their training, and then obviously pick their children up afterwards. So just simple flexibilities and logistics helped to overcome a barrier in that instance. For policymakers, so there's a recommendation around lobbying for an extension to this early leavers timeframe. So this is the idea that if a learner leaves within 6 weeks of starting, the training provider cannot claim that outcome, as it were. And recognising for supported apprentices, supported learners, it does take longer to build those links, and they may drop out and then come back in at the start. It's about offering community training venues. It's about running awards and ceremonies, for instance, that celebrate learners and provider success. Salford have done a lot around this, for instance. And it's about encouraging flexibility around functional skills and endpoint assessment processes for supported apprentices. The point was made that often these learners need a little bit more support to undertake these examinations. They might have had really poor previous experiences of exams, and it's scary for them going into classrooms and being under an independent invigilation. So can we get some flexibility around that to perhaps give learners a bit longer? It's important to note here that learners themselves aren't expecting a 3 pass on assessments. The learners told us directly they want to pass their exams. They want to have certificates and accreditation showing that they are skilled at what they say they're skilled in. But it's just about giving them a bit more time to demonstrate those skills. The importance of mentors was central throughout the evaluation research. So it was clear that delivering training through sort of large classroom sessions and that sort of learner-teacher approach that you might get in a mainstream secondary school or an FE college, that was seen as less effective. As mentioned, many of these learners had poor previous experiences, and going back into a classroom setting could be quite scary for them. They much preferred having what was, for younger learners, often called a sort of trusted adult or a mentor that they could speak with. And that mentor support would be wrapped around the classroom sessions. So the mentor could talk to them about pastoral issues, you know, outside of learning hours, perhaps at weekends or early in the morning, for instance, before training. And project teams recognise that lots of tutors don't necessarily have the skills you need to be a mentor. It's a feature of vocational training that often tutors have come from industry. That's where they've gained their skills, and that's the skills they're imparting to learners. It's unfair to expect them to also have sort of pastoral and mentor skills as well. So for practitioners, a key recommendation is around assigning or recruiting a learner mentor within your team and making sure that your learners can be in contact with that individual at various times, not expecting vocational tutors to perform that task. Also important if that mentor can reach out and engage with parents and family. Often learners have things going on in their wider lives, perhaps with younger or older siblings or parents, for instance, housing, income, other situations, etc. And if the mentor can be aware of that, then obviously they can understand why a learner's engagement with training or attendance at work might be a bit patchy at certain times, and they can advise they can advise tutors or line managers, for instance, in a sensitive way, that perhaps we need to give that learner a bit more space and time at certain points so that they can sustain their learning. In terms of advice for policymakers, so helping training providers to understand and specify the skills that a mentor needs, so almost like a job description, if you like, but also backing this up with funding or money so that training providers can employ mentors for supported apprenticeships, because this is over and beyond the delivery of the apprenticeship standard. It's that wraparound pastoral care, which some training providers do offer, sometimes more through academic routes, for instance, but being able to offer that to vocational learners as well. And noting that vocational learners aren't often in the training centre, so being able to offer it at different times of the day and at weekends and so on. Obviously, there's a cost to that that training providers need help to meet. In terms of supporting employers, so as I mentioned, the evidence suggests that learners on the 7 projects are doing well in the workplace and they feel well supported. Nevertheless, feedback from project teams and employers is that the pandemic has impacted the availability of apprenticeships. So initially the availability dried up, now there's a glut, and also that at this time in particular, when employers might have had staff on furlough, they're still working out their resourcing and whether staff are working at home or in the office or in between, for instance. They're nervous about taking on a new member of staff who has additional support needs. They're worried that they won't be able to be available to that new member of staff when they need them to. We've also learned that employer engagement, it needs to go beyond one member of staff. So lots of employers, one member of staff might stick their hand up, really be a champion for supported apprentices and supported learners. Often that individual might have someone within their own family, for instance, who has special educational needs or might be on the autistic spectrum, for instance. And that individual is often a champion. But if that young person or learner then moves on to another team, or the champion moves on to another company, that support can fall away quite quickly. We also learned that there are some topics where employers need professionally led training. The best example here is adverse childhood experiences, so ACE training. Obviously, that is a real big topic which can't be covered in an amateur way. It needs professional training, so employers understand the traumas that learners may have been through in their past and how they can support them with that. Recommendations for practitioners: being clear to employers about how you'll be supporting the learner and supporting them, and sharing information on the learner's history and their aspirations and so on, but doing so in a proportionate and sensitive way. So obviously it's not about giving the employer or the line manager a learner's life history, because there's a lot of sensitive data there, but it's about sharing information that the employer needs to know so they can understand why a learner might behave in certain ways at certain times. Being able to point employers towards source of training and advice is clearly crucial, and a policy recommendation around this for GMCA and us to take forwards is around commissioning, subsidising employers and training providers to have ACE training to understand their adverse childhood experiences and how that can impact upon learning. Other policy recommendations, we talked about identifying, celebrating, championing employers and staff. Obviously, GM has the Good Employment Charter. There are similar charters elsewhere in the country, and embedding supported learners and championing supported learners within those kind of structures. But also some practical things around advising employers on, advising training providers on how they can share information, for instance, with employers on learner needs. Just finally, on what we've learned around remote learning, I think it's fair to say that remote learning was a challenge for many participants in the project. More than half said they found it challenging. If you imagine, these learners have often struggled in school settings anyway, so to then be doing essentially sort of school type lessons but on a laptop sitting at home when you might not have reliable broadband or data was a challenge for many. Also in the workplace, the pandemic meant that many learners could feel a bit isolated. They weren't able to move around teams or move around settings, for instance. So that could mean that they didn't get the breadth of experience they'd hoped for. Recommendations for practitioners: trying to get learners into the training centre as often as possible within lockdown rules or whatever current regulations are, but also providing learners with hard copy materials. Several learners told us that having that kind of homework documentation meant that at weekends they could refer back to what they'd learned during the week. They could reassure themselves that they did have the knowledge, but on Monday morning, if they were going into the workplace, they'd be effective. So it could help them overcome a crisis of confidence. If possible, with the employers that you're working with, ask if a learner can visit different sites, different offices. If that's not possible, obviously small employers can't necessarily move apprentices or people on work placements around teams or around sites. A policy recommendation, obviously flexible apprenticeships, that idea that multiple employers supporting an apprentice might be one option there. Other recommendations for policymakers around helping training providers to offer online learning. So obviously that's hardware and software so that learners can access training at all times. And there's a recommendation around lobbying to extend the apprenticeship standard timelines for support apprentices. So it's still the case that a certain amount of training has to be delivered in a certain amount of time. Obviously, online learning slows that process of learning. So is it fair to expect supported learners in particular to achieve the number of hours learning they're meant to, given that sometimes they're learning online, sorry. Just briefly from me, last few minutes before I hand back to Amy, things that didn't work. So just pick out a few of these. Some of the projects sort of initially started by treating their supported learners as a separate group to other learners, sometimes giving them a different name, bringing them on different days. And that distinction they found didn't really work. The learners themselves, as we've talked about, didn't view aspects of their identity as a barrier. They liked engaging with others, building links and trust with other groups and so on. So dropping those distinctions early on and just treating supported learners as learners, really. The loss of level 2 apprenticeship standards following the recent review of standards, that was seen as a challenge. A lot of the projects felt they were delivering sort of introductory and wider training, which previously would have been covered under a level 2 standard. And that training is felt as necessary because supported learners often had missed out on some of that wider employability type skills and basic skills training from mainstream education. And another example given was don't try and place too many supported apprentices in one team. So this was the idea that an employer might come forwards and be really keen and say, yes, we want to help. But if they take on too many learners, one line manager or one team find they don't have the capacity to support all those learners with the additional needs that they have. So being careful how many learners you place in employers at the outset is important. Just finally, in terms of wider learning points, one of the things we thought at the start might be a barrier to the learners sustaining their apprenticeships and their training, etc., was financial pressures, that they would have demands to earn a wage, to cover other costs, for instance. But lots of the learners we spoke to face to face said no, they were focused on having a career and they saw a progression path. Cade speaking there in his video about it's not just about going to work in McDonald's or in the supermarket or in a coffee shop and getting a wage. He's focused on his career as an electrician and how that can develop, and others told us that as well. There's a clear idea about dropping this term supported learner, supported apprentice, supported intern. Instead, sort of inclusion of all types of learners should be core to all training provider and employer actions. And also the point that providing wraparound support is expensive. But from Salford's work, there's more detail in Salford's own research, it does seem to be cost effective. So these learners, when you consider what they might have been doing if they weren't being supported, it's actually more cost effective to provide the wraparound pastoral support they need to help them to sustain their learning and progress in their careers. So just picked up a few issues there, happy to pick up more in the chat and the Q&A. I see there have been some questions posted, which we'll try and answer. But now I'm going to hand back to Amy and she can talk about how GMCA are going to take this further in terms of policy.
Thanks, David. So yes, for us as the combined authority, removing barriers has identified some places where we can focus and have a really big impact. So not all of these are in our power alone, and we certainly can't do it all at once, but we've got some areas where we think we can take things forward and see what we might be able to do. And some of these are obviously in addition to the policy recommendations that David mentioned earlier. So if we just go on to the next slide. So we've got a couple of ideas of areas for future work. So we know from this that additional learner support funding is not sufficient to cover the needs of many learners. So we can look at lobbying for this to be increased, or maybe we can subsidise it and cover it elsewhere, or even just making it more flexible. At the moment, a lot of the flexibilities are quite restrictive based on a narrow range of needs. So we might be able to flex or subsidise that. We also want to look at building additional capacity for mentoring in training providers and other organisations that work with young people particularly, to improve the learner experience and to improve retention, because we know that poor experience on a programme might turn them off future attempts, so it's worth putting in the resource now. And maybe we could look at things like counselling or youth work skills for tutors where they are an appropriate person to have that training. We also learn that job opportunities are a really good foot in the door to working with local communities. So work and skills programmes connect people with other much needed services like English as a second language, housing, domestic violence support. So we can try to be more integrated in our wider work. If someone is knocking on the door for a work programme, then they don't need to be knocking on someone else's door for help with housing. If we can get them through, they've got to the right door and we can connect them up more efficiently. We've also learnt that mental health continues to be a barrier. That's a problem we can't solve just through apprenticeships, but it's even more proof of just how important it is to tackle. Poor mental health impacts so many areas of our work, and it's evidence for employers that including mental health within occupational health is really important. So that's something that we can support with information sharing and awareness raising. We've also learnt that many young people are less work ready now than they would have been pre-pandemic at a similar age, because they've missed out on key experiences of work and also the social development of being in a classroom. So employers might need to adjust their expectations when they're taking on a young person. And we could look at doing some awareness raising with employers, especially those that we know to be kind of warm already and open to doing things to take on new staff. And importantly, currently there's a recruitment crisis, which most of us are probably very aware of, and there's unprecedented apprenticeship vacancies that employers cannot fill, which means that employers might be more open to more inclusive and creative recruitment options. So it's really important that we strike while the iron is hot, basically. So unfortunately, they're not signed off, so I can't tell you exactly what we're doing, but based on this, we are looking at hopefully commissioning some further work, which as soon as I'm allowed to share it, I will share. But to say that removing barriers has been an invaluable piece of research, and I mean it's had an incredible impact on the individuals that it's worked with, but it's also had a really, really big impact for us. The things that we've tested and we know work, and the things that we've tested and we know don't work, because that's just as important as finding out what does work, so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. That's sensible for us. It's been a fantastic piece of research, and it's been a real privilege to be part of it as well. So it's so nice to see so many people from the projects on the call today. And just to say thank you to you all for all the work that you've done, because it's supported individuals and it's really pushed us along in our thinking on what we can do with improving access to apprenticeships. So that's everything we wanted to present to you. So I want to open it up to questions. I will have a quick look and see what questions we've got in the chat, but if you would like to come on and ask a question, if you just pop your hand up, and we'll come to you. I can see Gavin, you've got your hand up.
Good day, everyone. Can you all hear me? Just let me know.
Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to introduce myself. I'm an associate researcher with URSA. I've popped a note in the chat. I head up the neurodiversity component of URSA and its delivery for youth development. I've had a long-standing interest in youth development, and my current research and as an academic at London South Bank is on youth development and apprenticeships and transition for youth into the world of work. So my details are in the chat if you'd like to contact me. So I don't like the word expert, but you could say I have an understanding. The current challenge is with youth transitioning into apprenticeships is youth don't know what they don't know. And when they transition back into university or their developments, there's a huge lack of underfunding in advice and guidance in schools today, and there just isn't the resources. And so we know that under the Baker clause that this is supposed to be happening, but it currently isn't happening. And subsequently, I spoke to Lord Shipley last week, and I presented evidence to Lord Shipley review, some of which you may know of. And the evidence is rather telling as far as the situation, particularly the Nissen report in Lord Shipley's review on youth unemployment. I encourage everyone to have a read of that. And so, yes, the only way we can get on, I think, is to work collectively as a group and a community, particularly with neurodiverse youth, into the world of apprenticeships and the world of work. I'm happy to take questions and support those that are here. Just want to thank those that have made a contribution here as well. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin. I spotted a question earlier from Harry. Let me just have a quick look. How many people with a learning disability were on the programme, and what was the success rate? So I don't know, David, do you have those numbers to hand?
I do have those numbers to hand, Amy. Thanks to you and my team for digging those up whilst I was talking you through the slides. So Harry, in answer to your question, 40 of the 145 learners consider themselves to have a learning difficulty or disability. So just under a third. Of those, 5 are on a level 2 or level 3 apprenticeship, and others are taking up different training, sort of preparatory training for apprenticeships across various areas. In terms of the barriers that those groups feel they face to learning, so from the baseline survey, the group of learners with learning difficulties and disabilities were more likely than non-LLDD learners to identify their health as a barrier to training. They're more likely to think they'd struggle in terms of travelling for training or work, and they were more worried about working and studying with strangers than non-LLD learners. It's important to note that for all three of those, it was still under half of the learners who identified themselves as having a learning difficulty or disability who said they were concerned about those barriers. So they either strongly agreed or agreed that those would be barriers. So still a majority of LLDD learners did not feel that those would be significant barriers to their progress. But generally, as I say, it seemed to be minorities of LLD learners look at their health, their anxiety about working with strangers, and issues around travel. And going to new places to study and to work were seen as barriers. So that's a brief summary. We are, as part of the research, producing sort of standalone case studies, which are looking at what we term the SEND cohort. So that picks up learners who perhaps don't have any HCP as well, Education, Health and Care Plan, and their experiences and projects and what we learned about that group. We're doing a case study on BME learners, and also we're looking at gender stereotypes as well. So that is a space for a bit more exploration of the experiences of that group, the LLDD group, and how they can be supported. But hopefully that's just giving you a quick overview of the barriers that group faced.
Thanks, David. Did anyone else have a question they wanted to put to the group? Matt, you got your hand up.
Yeah, it was around the financial side of it. I was just interested to know, in terms of apprenticeship grants, obviously that's critical to, I suppose, incentivising employers to consider any apprentice, but in particular, you know, those young people or those people that have got more challenges, or they've come from more vulnerable backgrounds, in particular sort of the SEND side as well. So I was just wondering, out of the people who progressed onto apprenticeships, like, is there any information around the grants that were accessed as part of that process? I'm kind of coming at it from obviously the local authority that I come from in Wigan. You know, we've offered apprenticeship grants to employers in the past, and it's something that we're keen to look to do again. I know that the government had kind of increased grant incentives due to COVID, but that's now reverted back to the sort of standard level. So I suppose it's really kind of how much of a critical sort of factor that grant is in actually. I know you said, Amy, you know, we need to strike while the iron's hot in terms of the recruitment challenges, which is absolutely right. But we found in the past, in particular with our sort of like SEND sort of residents and young people in particular, that it's the financial side of it that becomes more of a challenge in convincing an employer to progress someone, for example, from a supported internship into an apprenticeship, because often with the SEND people, they tend to be sort of slightly older. So obviously the more costly from the wage perspective as well. So
yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of how relevant the incentives were for these employers that were involved in this project, so the employers largely were, not exclusively, but largely were involved right from the start. So Northern Care Alliance was always involved in those Oldham projects. So they were already a warm employer. I'm sure the incentives are great and much appreciated, but it wasn't needed as a hook because they were already involved and interested. That said, I think more generally, the unfortunate loss of the incentives is going to be a loss. I think it's difficult, and personally I would love for them to continue, because I think it makes such a big difference for a small employer. It's an easy hook for them, and it's when you're a small employer taking on someone on a lower wage, because it's a lower level apprenticeship, those really quite significant incentives can almost be seen as a salary subsidy for the first 3 months, say. So I think they are really useful. It will be interesting to see whether the recruitment crisis is enough of a hook to get employers interested without needing extra financial incentive. But I think it's a really relevant question, definitely, and it's something that we're lobbying for incentives to be extended, because I think they should be, but how much impact that will have remains to be seen. Gavin Owen, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Amy. It's not often my surname has to be clarified because
Other Gavin.
Gavin's, yeah, on the same call. David, it's a question that you touched on yourself around the barriers, and I remember, you know, as we started off, when you'd done the initial speaking to some of the cohorts, that they didn't perceive themselves as having barriers to apprenticeships. And you said about turning it round to be positive language about opening doors and pathways and guidance. And I think I don't know whether that was picked up in what we learned, and whether that would be the practitioners or the policy, and how the combined authority and other organisations that are working with people that are perceived to have barriers, you know, if there was any, you know, more learning from that that we could use.
I think you're right, Gavin. That was one of the striking, if not the most striking thing from the research. About 70% of learners at the baseline survey, you know, and that was the best part of 100 or so learners saying that they did not feel any aspect of their identity was a barrier, but rather it was their knowledge, their experience that they saw as a barrier. You know, that education and training and progressing in a career is not something for me, you know, almost kind of that ship sailed, you know, I got excluded, or I had to drop out of mainstream education for other reasons, for instance, you know, and therefore I can't go back. And I suppose there's wider recommendations. I mean, I'm also drawing on wider stuff we've done around careers hubs, for instance, and access to HE, around, are we getting enough sort of alumni, if you like, for want of a better word, speaking to these young people and saying, look, I was in a similar position to you. You know, I come from a similar neighbourhood perhaps, or have faced similar issues in my family life or wider social life, and I have progressed through that, and where I work, you know, people who work there welcome me and are like me and are similar to me, you know, that kind of, oh, they've done it, I can do it as well. I think that's key. We can see, especially on the Salford project, you know, a lot of celebratory activity around, you know, what the group has achieved and helping others in similar situations, and no doubt the other projects are doing that as well. So I think that's key. And then, as we say, we talked, didn't we, a bit in network meetings about, you know, changing the language from barriers to opportunities for apprenticeships, and saying, you know, that to this group, yes, you can reach out and achieve that, and it's not that your opportunity is past already. You know, there are routes back into training that you can take, and which can give you a worthwhile career. Definitely. Amy, do you want to come in on any points that Gavin's raised?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, David. I think in terms of terminology, we've kind of batted around lots of different ideas of, you know, is it about opportunities? Is it about opening doors? I quite like opening doors, because I can see it in my head and I kind of see what I'm imagining. We talk sometimes about sort of accessible apprenticeships as well, but I think often that gives a sense that it's about just getting someone in the door and then off you go, enjoy your apprenticeship, you'll do great now. And while that is the case for some people, they need help getting in the door and then they're fine. There's other people that actually, when we talk about supported apprenticeships, it's about support on programme. So sometimes accessible feels like a one and done, get in the door. We've not quite ever come to a sort of decision on terminology and how we should be doing things, but we do know that while we've said removing barriers about 100 times in the past hour, that doesn't seem to be the language that resonates with learners, whether they're young or older. So it's definitely something for us in future, I think.
I think also, Amy, just something else that's come to me was, and touched upon this quickly, but I had to go through quickly in a presentation, was learners over the age of 25 within the cohort were more likely to say that they thought other education and training routes were better quality, were more suited to them. It does appear to be that the younger learners on projects understand and recognise apprenticeships and see them as having value. But there's perhaps still a preconception amongst the older learners, those who have left education perhaps up to 10 or more years ago, that apprenticeships are something for younger learners, that they're lower quality, that they lead to lower paid opportunities and so on. So I think for training providers and policymakers, tailoring that message to groups as well. So not just about changing the wording, which I agree with Amy is necessary, but then following up with that and saying, okay, and how do you then pitch your training opportunity to an older female learner? Then it's probably around the logistics and the way that they engage with training, and that you can do an apprenticeship. Whereas pitching it to a younger learner, it might be around, people like you have done this and they've got a good career out of it, and they've made progress despite not having stellar GCSEs or having a slightly patchy education record. So yeah, I think that point around tailoring the pitch to different groups as well is really important.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
I'm going to come to Sarah, but just while Sarah's asking her question, Polly, can you just have a double check of if there are any other questions, and we'll try and get to them quickly before we finish. So Sarah.
Hi everyone, so I'm Sarah Scanlon, I'm from Salford City Council, so obviously on the Salford project. Just while everyone was talking, just a couple of bits that were going through my mind, and just picking up on the incentives and the grants and stuff. I think that's definitely part of the solution. And to be honest, creating opportunities, although we managed to get 12 apprenticeship starts, which was fantastic. They were all with the same employer, which was For Housing, our local social housing partner. And a bit like what Amy was saying earlier, they were there from the start, and they'd already committed to be part of this. But getting anything more broadly from other employers was much more challenging. Now, of course, part of that is COVID. We were doing this project in the middle of a pandemic where creating opportunities was hard, and there was still a heavy work from home message. And I know from a city council point of view, that made life really difficult for us to try and create apprenticeship opportunities working from home. It just didn't feel right. So timing wise was a bit off. But I do think from an employer point of view, it'd be interesting to work more closely with employers about what do they deem as what capacity do they feel they need to offer the support that some of the young people and adults that we've been talking about might need. Because I personally think there's some level of the perception of what support some people need rather than actually what they actually need on the ground. And actually, it's not too hard. Sometimes I think some employees may put it in the too hard bracket just because it feels that way, when actually I know some of the research that GMCA, CVO and other partners have done around general kind of recruitment practices and other bits and pieces related to young people, it's just tweaks. It's not actually that hard. So I think there's definitely some legacy work probably to do around that. And I'd probably say that all businesses have got employees that have got some level of additional needs in some way, whether they're labelled in some way or not. I'm sure when we all look at our own individual teams, there are people that need slight adjustments, particular ways of working together. And that's fine, isn't it? We all accept that. So I think it's just about having that in the back of our minds as well. And I think one of the greatest impacts that we feel we had, as well as the transition mentor kind of role, and I'm glad Lorraine's on the call today, but it's been mentioned as part of the learning, which is a massive feature. But we were able to bring the employer and the training provider much closer together more regularly. And I think that had a real massive impact because they were able to have those kind of real practical and operational discussions, not actually just about how the young person was getting on, which was quality in itself, but actually help the employer understand that whole new world of EPA and what kind of experiences and skills those apprentices needed to have exposure to. That was really helpful, because we ended up with some apprentices going on secondments in other parts of the business so that they could create those opportunities. And I think there's probably still a way to go for a lot of businesses, and rightly so, to get their heads around what EPA really does involve. And I would say, without all of those kind of real regular conversations, I would put money on the fact that a lot of our project participants would be NEET by now. We mentioned there's a kind of cost benefit analysis that we've done, and it is pretty significant. You know, what could have happened if that support hadn't been put in place. But there's also a lot of additional costs that goes in with it. There's a lot of additional, those extra meetings that the college and the providers were having, the employers were having, lots of other stuff going on behind the scenes to try and make sure that those young people were well supported. And it, you know, that is particularly significant. And I'm not sure exactly how we work that out, but it does need to be part of what we look at. And then just on going back to the creating ops, I think we do need to find a way to link it to the social value agenda. And how we maximise and create opportunities through that. I think there's a lot of work to do to make things even better. Certainly, in Salford, we've got a lot of investment going in, and to all kinds of, whether it's building projects or otherwise. So I think we're really acutely aware that we want to do more on that. I'm just conscious of time, Amy. I'll shut up. Thank you.
No, that's really great, Sarah. And I think you're absolutely right about social value particularly. I know it's something that I see a lot of, that sometimes when we score bids from people, they say, my social value is that I create apprenticeships. And we say, well, that's great, but actually you need those apprentices. What more can you be doing? Is it specifically targeting underrepresented groups, or is it making extra ones? We can go a bit further actually than just creating jobs for people, and I think it's a really good one to be looking at. I'm going to very quickly come to Matt, and then Gavin, I think you've got your hand up, but if we'll try and sneak it in, but conscious of time. So Matt.
Yeah, really quickly. I think that's a good point about the social value. We've got something in Wigan called a deal for business, which we've just refreshed, and obviously part of that is recruiting apprentices and things like that, but we can also sort of push more around the sort of those more challenging groups as well. Another one's like linked to the sort of finances side of it, potential to sort of look at a wider package around like levy transfers as well, because obviously some of these for our SMEs, you know, there's going to be a cost in terms of that co-financing as well. So is it something that local authorities or bigger employers could look to support around that kind of agenda? Lots of comparisons sort of with Kickstart and what's been talked about in terms of the findings, you know, mental health, the need for sort of mentoring and, you know, and that side of it. And that's really something that we found with Kickstart. And then the last one that I kind of mentioned was, I know it was mentioned around the potential for using adult education budget funding for supporting employers, you know, and training up employers to kind of like be able to support individuals better. Maybe that's something that we could look at as well through skills for growth, whether that's an option as well. Because again, I think that would be something that's quite good to sort of build in and make available to employers.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, well, I can't give you any details of anything we're looking at the moment because it's not been signed off. It is something we're looking at, sort of commission, wherever the money comes from. We are looking to try and commission something out off the back of this. So very relevant and noted points, Matt. Gavin.
Yes, just a quick one. Well, it just relates to what Sarah was saying and Matt was saying about NEETs. There's a work by Professor Amanda Kirby, Cardiff University, and she also runs a website called Do It Profiler. The app on Do It Profiler is really useful to get an orientation for a young person on Google, and it works very quickly. It's quite easy to function with and Do It Profiler. And of course, Amanda Kirby is also very good in terms of resource and directing this sort of thing. And once again, I'm also happy to take questions and support yourselves and people in this group with my research. So thank you again to everyone who's contributed here today.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. So I think that brings us to the end then. We will wrap it up. So If you would like to know more about the programme, hopefully you've enjoyed today. If you would like to know more about the programme, please do get in touch with me or David, or any of the project teams we can put you in touch with if they're open to it. There will be, as we mentioned, a full report coming out soon, which really digs into the detail of all of this. So if numbers are your thing, that's where you want to go. And if you would like to share the Removing Barriers programme with other people in your organisations, do share this webinar once it's recorded and sent out. But we can also come and do mini versions of this presentation at team and network meetings where it's going to be relevant. So if you would like that, do let us know. If I could ask one thing of everyone, it's please could you fill in the feedback form that I've just posted in the chat. It will also come round in an email afterwards, but it's great to get feedback immediately if you've got a couple of minutes. It's the feedback form that we're using for all of our National Apprenticeship Week events, so it might not be specific to Removing Barriers, but if you could fill it in, it would be really, really useful. And it just remains to say thank you all so much for coming, and especially big thank you to everyone who's worked on the Removing Barriers programme in one way or another. It's been an amazing thing to work on, and the impact has been incredible for us and for the learners on the programme. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to David today, my co-host. Happy Apprenticeship Week, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.